Good morning still. My name is Chris Henry with the House Fiscal Division. I'll be presenting the FY20 HB 105 budget for the Department of Revenue. First off, like other presentations today, we've broken out the table of contents so you see the organization. This helps for future reference and just to give you kind of a roadmap of what we're going to be looking at today. Next up on page 3, we'll talk about the department's organization. The Department of Revenue has 3 programs within it: tax collections, alcohol tobacco control, and the Office of Charitable Gaming. Page 4 details some of the activities within the tax collection program. Those include the administration, tax policy management, revenue collection and distribution, taxpayer assistance, tax compliance, and tax enforcement. Next, you get an idea for alcohol and tobacco control. That's the Administration and Certification Division, also the Enforcement Division. And last up, the Office of Charitable Gaming, which has their own administrative section, certification, and also finally the Audit and Enforcement section. The members, we're now on the page 7, which gets us our first look at the department's budget, and we'll take a look at their 10-year history. First thing I'd like to point out, when you look at the total means of finance and the state effort trend lines at the very top, the red and the green lines, there's just a slight variation between those. That comes from interagency transfers. We're going to look later, but the department is almost entirely made up of fees and self-generated revenue. There's a few years you'll see some state general fund in there as well, but there's a slight bit of IET and a slight bit of statutory dedications that give us that little discrepancy between the total means of finance and the state effort. To tell you a little bit more of the story that's happening in this 10-year mark, one of the big things you'll notice starting around FY12 but up into 13, 14, and 15 is when we had the tax amnesty program. So you see the ramp up in total means of finance where actual expenditures were growing. That's just the necessity and the workload that came associated with that amnesty program, where the department was collecting more money, expending more money to administer that program. We also have a couple behind the scenes action happening here too. If you notice in FY15, the department had to have a little bit of general fund added in there, which increased in FY16, FY17, and FY18. Partially this is because those amnesty fees, as the department started collecting that money, it was essentially used for other purposes by the administration. So they did not have the fees and self-generated revenue to continue operation. They asked for a general fund to supplant that. Also, the dip you see in FY17, it's not as noticeable in the general fund, but you'll see it more in total means of finance. That was also a mid-year reduction. I believe it was about $28.5 million in general fund was removed for their budget during that deficit elimination process for FY17. We go into a little bit more normalcy. We see some growth here in FY18, FY19 budget, and the FY20 proposal before you. But I also want to note their department is back off of general fund. We'll see that they have no state general fund in the current budget and none recommended for next year as well. Next up on page 8, we can take a look at their major sources of funding. I mentioned earlier most of the department's budget comes from self-generated revenue. It's about $107 million, and you see that in the middle. The revenue comes from multi-fees, late payment delinquency, negligence fees, underestimated tax, debt recovery as well, and then fines, licenses, permits, and fines from a couple of the other programs. Interagency transfers, we mentioned those two. That's just at $305,000. Most of that comes from the Department of Public Safety, but some also from the Department of Health, and that goes to ATC. Mainly you'll see those are for random unannounced inspections, but that just makes up, it's actually less than 1% of the department's funding. Statutory dedications, it's about $550,000 in the current FY20 HB 105 budget. That all comes from the Tobacco Regulation Enforcement Fund, which receives its money from 1/4 of 1/20th of 1% of the tax on cigarettes. And you'll see the actual calculation there is just about, that's a pretty small fraction. On page 9, we take a look at their funding change. Again, I mentioned there's no general fund in the current budget or in HB 105. The change from actuals there, the decrease of $33.9 million in general fund. If you recall, toward the end of the regular session and during the second and third special sessions of 2018, there was a plan originally to use a balance of fees that the department had to fund the LeGov implementation. Well, at the end of the day, we had only funded the first year of LeGov implementation. To make that a little, I guess it simplified things, the department just had that funding reduced from HB1 in the state general fund, and they had more authority to spend those fees in the current year. Interagency transfers is at $305,000 for next year. That's a $150,000 decrease, and that reduction comes from an IET agreement with the Louisiana Department of Health. It's a reduction to the alcohol tobacco program. There's $107 million in fees and self-generated revenue, and that's a $2.4 million increase compared to the current year. Most of that's just an increase in their budget authority, so they can spend projected calculations and their accumulated balance on any of those anticipated increases they have in expenditures. And then statutory dedications will remain level at $550,000, and this again comes from that Tobacco Regulation Enforcement Fund. Grand total brings their budget recommended in FY20 to $107, about $0.9 million. That's $2.3 million over what we have currently. On page 10, you can look at the expenditure change for FY20. The main expenditure categories you'll see for the department: salaries, related benefits, make up the bulk of the department's funding. It's about $40 million in salaries, $1.6 million in other compensation, $26.4 million in related benefits. There's also a small amount for travel, about $900,000. There's $6.3 million in operating services, $400,000 for supplies, $1.8 million in professional services, and $29.8 million in other charges, and then a small about $500,000 there for acquisitions and major repairs. We're going to talk a little bit more about these in the next couple slides, which should give you that high-level overview. You also notice there's no change in authorized positions. They've stayed steady at 712. Although there is a story behind it for the next year's budget, there's actually a reduction of 5 positions and an add of 5. And we'll mention that in one or two slides ahead. Looking a little deeper at some of these changes in expenditures, there's a $1.6 million increase in personal services. That comes from an $890,000 increase in salaries, and that's the adjustments for the market rate, salary base, projected attrition savings, and some workload adjustments. There's a $1.2 million increase, and that comes from related benefits, and these are those adjustments to the retirement rate, group insurance rate, and then a $474,000 decrease. I mentioned there's a net change in the authorized positions, but that $474,000 comes from the elimination of 5 positions in the tax collection program. For operating services, there's a net $286,000 increase. Most of that comes from a decrease. That's $275,000 from moving expenses. The Office of Charitable Gaming moved into the LaSalle building in the current year, and they won't need those expenses for next year. And then there's an increase of $571,000, and those costs are associated with opening up tax collection field offices around the state as well as in Houston. For other charges, there's about a $340,000 increase. There's a little bit more happening behind the scenes here. $3.1 million is a reduction in expenses for technology and also IET agreements that are currently being non-recurred. There's a $1.2 million decrease, and that's a reduction in rent payments. It's the office space that they occupy in the LaSalle building. I believe a similar situation that happened in the Claiborne building where they paid off some of those bonds and the rent payments are not as high as they would have been with those. $3.6 million is an increase, and that's funding to replace the department's imaging and data capture system. That'll make the department more efficient and have better services that they actually will be able to partner up with other departments to provide data capture and imaging. And then finally, an $851,000 increase, and that comes from just a net increase in statewide services such as their technology services fees, risk management, and legislative auditor fees. On the next page, we look a little bit more. $55,000 is for acquisitions and major repairs. That's a net change as well. $436,000 is for non-recurring acquisitions. $166,000 is an increase, and that's for office chairs. That's for the staff in the LaSalle building. $3,000 is for projectors for training. $95,000 for office furniture for those new regional field offices we mentioned on the last slide. $82,000 is equipment for the ATC agents. This is firearms, ammunition, uniforms. And $145,000 for replacement of 4 enforcement vehicles for those ATC agents. And then again, I mentioned there's a net zero change in authorized position, but that comes from a elimination of 5 positions and their associated funding within the tax collection program. But there's also an increase of 5 positions in the ATC program, and that's to bolster enforcement needs. You'll see that's pertaining to the illegal shipment of alcohol in the state, the new e-cigarette and vapor compliance, and human trafficking compliance. On the next page, you'll see a little bit of their expenditure history. This gives you an idea kind of how those expenditures have changed over the last few years. Again, most of those expenditures all come in personnel services. Depending on how people come and go, those can change year to year, but you'll see they've hovered around 60 million to 70 million. Sort of the budget numbers you'll see in the current year, and almost up to 70 for the next year. Other charges for next year is about 30 million. We're going to break those down in a couple slides so you can see the detail on those different expenses as well. On page 14, you'll see our expenditure trend projections. Again, we looked at their actual spending up until the end of February and projected out based on 3-year historical spending patterns to give you an idea that they might have about $14.5 million unspent at the end of the year. This is all coming from their fees and self-generated revenue. Again, there's about 99% of that department's budget comes from fees and self-generated revenue. And there's also language you'll find in House Bill 105 that allows the department to use prior year and current year collections for their budget and fees and self-generated revenue. So anything that they don't spend this year, they're allowed to use next year. And they've actually built in some of those projections for FY20. So some of that anticipated unspent money is already included in House Bill 105 for FY20. And to give you that historical perspective, last year in FY18, they didn't spend about 9.5 of their budget authority. And then on page 15, you'll see that detail on their other charges expenditures. By far the biggest is IT. And they had this is the services that are performed by the Office of Technology Services dealing with the IT consolidation a few years ago. Tax collection, revenue collection, it's a very intensive IT field, sending out and dealing electronic banks, $15 million. There's also $3.1 million in rent and building maintenance. That includes the spaces that they occupy in Benson Tower. $2.9 million in state mail, $2.6 million in OTS fees, and that's predominantly for telecommunications, not necessarily just the IT. $1.6 million in state printing, $716,000 in other charges positions, and those particularly with the call center. And then $660,000 for risk management premiums, about $640,000 in legislative auditor fees, $400,000 for payments to the Treasury, and then $293,000 for ATC investigator travel. And then all the other small ones we've rolled up, about $1.4 million there. That gives us a total of $29.8 in total other charges. Next slide, we take a look at their personnel a little more in depth. Similar to other slides, they've got about $41.6 million in salaries and other compensation, along with $26.4 in related benefits. So total personnel is about $60 million. If we take out their other charges, that makes up about 87.2% of their budget. If you back other charges back into it, it's still about 63%. So most of that money still goes toward their personnel. They have 712 authorized positions, 701 are classified, 11 unclassified, 15 other charges positions, 6 non-TO FTEs, and as of January 31st, the department had 62 vacancies. In the budget for FY20, 5 vacant positions were eliminated, and again, 5 new authorized positions created. And if you look at the historical spending there, again, we kind of have that story of the tax amnesty program and the need for additional staff. And see that kind of spike there in FY 2015 on their salaries and other compensation. But generally over time, the Department of Revenue has seen a lot of authorized positions reductions, both in the tax collection program, also in the ATC program as well. Members, I've put in a few kind of lagniappe slides here. A couple on the Office of Debt Recovery. This was established in Act 399 of the 2013 regular session. And this is to collect delinquent debts, accounts, and claims on behalf of other agencies. And this is to give you kind of a snapshot of some of the status with ODR. As of December 31st, there were state agencies. ODR had 771 accounts from state agencies, 771,000 accounts, I'm sorry. 3,000 from higher education institutions, and 15,000 from local municipalities. That's a grand total of about 790,000 debt accounts and almost $500 million of debt that ODR is working to collect. And then a little bit more in depth, you'll notice operationally, ODR operates entirely on a 25% fee that is placed on top of the debt. So when ODR collects a fee, collects a debt, there's an actual fee on top of that. Whenever they collect that debt, 100% of the original debt goes back to the agency. Everything that they collect goes back to them. You'll see, again here, I've just included for reference a little bit on those collections over the last few fiscal years. Grand total, they've collected about $140 million in debt for the state. The last two slides look a little bit at their performance information. This is just kind of some data that we put together in a graph for you members. The historical cost per $100 collected. You'll see the department only had 1 year where it cost them $1 to collect $100. And that was kind of the height of the tax amnesty program. Those numbers have gone down a little bit. You know, you've seen FY17 about 78 cents per $100. And then on the last one, a little bit about ATC licenses, and this is the total amounts of alcohol permits processed and the total amount of tobacco permits processed. And I put that up against ATC's authorized positions. Those have been reduced over the last number of years, but you see those workloads on the permits have still maintained pretty steady numbers. And finally, our department contact, Secretary Robinson, is here with us this morning, as well as Clarence Lyman, Undersecretary. That's everything for the Department of Revenue.
Thank you, Chris. Madam Secretary, can you state your name for the record and add any comments, please?
Kimberly Robinson, Secretary, Department of Revenue, and I think Chris did a great job going through everything related to our budget.
Could you add on the fund balances? What y'all plans are? Chris mentioned something about fund balances. Can you add some more detail to that?
As far as
do you plan on utilizing all of those in the next budget?
Correct. Everything that is carried over from the current year to the next year, just as within the last year, our revenues being fees and self-generated revenue, we typically can't anticipate exactly how much we will have in the next year in fees and self-generated because it depends on taxpayer activity. So we always anticipate using what is carried forward in next year's budget, and we start off with that money to operate. That way we don't go to the Treasury for a seed to fund operations.
So your FY20 budget is 10% more than the budget the department actually spent. Would you consider your budget a standstill budget in those regards?
In the fact that we are spending some additional resources to reopen offices around the state. For those of you that are outside of Baton Rouge, you know that your constituents have to come into Baton Rouge when they want to do business with the Department of Revenue. We found that is not efficient for taxpayers to have to drive into Baton Rouge or go to the New Orleans office. Having physical space outside of Baton Rouge is very helpful for taxpayers. So we're going to have those additional expenses of having our staff located in those offices again and having the rent associated with that. So
and what locations would those be across the state outside of Baton Rouge?
So we're going to start with space in Lafayette, Monroe, Shreveport, and then we're looking at space in Lake Charles. We already have the Lafayette space, and then we also will have Alexandria. But I think there's an issue with the Alexandria space. As my understanding was, we would be in the state building that's in Alexandria, but there's recently been an issue brought to our attention related to potential issues with the Well, I wasn't going to say that, Clarence. So we're not going to go into. There's something related to the space in the building potentially, so we're going to be looking at maybe another space in Alexandria other than the state office building. But we were also going to the Alexandria office as well.
I appreciate that information. And just a few questions. What percentage of Louisiana tax returns are audited every year?
Individual, corporate, or sales use. I mean, we audit all of the different tax returns that come in, so we have different percentages that apply across the board. But
can we get some general information on
generally
personal tax returns, corporate tax returns? How many of those y'all audit in each year?
For individual income taxpayers, I would say that it's less than 5% of individual income taxpayers are audited with a full audit where an auditor goes out. Now, there are desk audits because we have so many returns that credits are claimed, and those credits have to be reviewed by an actual person. So that increases the number of returns that get an audit, but it's not an auditor going out to see the taxpayer. So
Do y'all
actual
look
auditor
at
going
numbers
out.
to how much y'all get on a return on investment for how much funds are expended doing audits versus what type of proceeds just are seen coming back to the state? Do y'all do those ratios and measure yourself every year in that regard?
We have complete statistics on our audit program, our field audit program. Per auditor collections, the average over the last 5 years of audit collections is about 1.4 million per auditor. We have roughly 120 auditors right now, and those auditors over the last 5 years generated, I think, 1.4. Yes, it is actually 1.403 million in collections, and that includes the amnesty years, which were higher in terms of collections because so much was resolved under amnesty. And for 1 year, which was last year,
So every auditor is producing $1.4 million a return. What type of expenses have y'all associated with per auditor in that regard?
their salary, the overhead related to those auditors, and that overhead is spread, building, technology, everything, travel.
Yeah, if you
all those
allocate it,
costs.
what does that number look like?
The average per auditor, do you have the exact number?
Somewhere around 75,000.
I think 75,000 average for the overhead cost, and then that salary and related benefits for the average person.
So it's safe to say it's a positive return.
Yes.
Those ratios pretty consistent for the last 8 years.
Yes, and we actually have the average going back to the 80s, I think, and I think that's probably in this chart as well. We can tell you what an auditor brought in the average per auditor going back to the 80s. We track that pretty consistently. And just the last year alone, 1 year average was 654,000.
So your main funding is through fees and self-generated funds, correctly?
Correct.
So how do you contend with maybe the message going to the constituents that you generate most of your money on fines and penalties? How do you sort of explain to constituents that you're not being motivated to find fines and penalties, but you're just doing the job for the state and trying to enforce the tax code? How do you balance that?
So in terms of the fees or fines or penalties, those are automatically imposed at the system level based on the laws that the legislature has passed. So we don't increase those. Those are set. For example, if your return is filed late, the system is programmed based upon the statute that says it's 5% maximum for a 30 days late filed return. That is imposed by the system. It's not imposed by a person. And so that taxpayer knows that if that return was due the 20th day of the month for a sales tax return and that return is not filed, then the system automatically imposes that, and it's not a person that's doing it.
And it's not on a contingency fee type basis.
Not a
It's a set
contingency
fee.
fee. It's a
Every
set-
taxpayer knows up front. It's transparent.
Correct. It's written in the statutes. It's on the return, the information that comes out with the instructions for the return. If it's not timely filed, these are the penalties that may be imposed, interest accrues, and how it is accrued. All of those things are spelled out specifically.
Earlier you mentioned roughly 5% of the personal tax returns are audited. Do you have some numbers for corporate tax returns and some of the other categories? Is it roughly the same, or is it any?
It is roughly, and we say that it's less than 5%.
Across the board for all
Across
these
the
different?
board. And actually for sales, it is probably less than that number in terms of audits. For that, withholding is a much smaller number that gets audited because that's every withholding return that's filed. We typically don't do withholding audits, but we are increasing those withholding audits as part of a task force with the Workforce Commission because of the issue we found with contractors that are not correctly classifying their workers. So we've started increasing the number of withholding audits that we're doing, but it is still probably less than 1% of withholding returns that get audited.
We talked about performance indicators for auditors. What about Office of Debt Recovery? What are those numbers looking like on getting returns and collecting state debt that's owed?
I'll let Mr. Lyman give an update, but I think our return on investment, that office is our smallest staffed office in the department. So I'll let Mr.
You
Lyman
can
get
go ahead
into
and
those
state your name for the
details.
record, please.
Clarence Lyman, Undersecretary, Department of Revenue. So as it relates to the Office of Debt Recovery, since inception in 2015, we have about $140 million collected. Now, in that office, we have a total of 5 people, perhaps about 5, that's actually performing that function full time.
And how much do we have allocated per head there? 75,000 roughly, like the auditors, or is that number similar?
I would think that's very similar. Now, a lot of the tools they use are the same tools that are used in our regular tax debt collection as well. A lot of those electronic tools, but the staff in that unit actually make calls. They actually do garnishments, whether it be wage or bank type garnishments. So they're a full-fledged collection entity, just like we do on the tax side. So we try not to make a distinction between tax and non-tax debt collections as much as possible there.
Now, we've collected 140 million, but are we at a point where we've sort of collected all we can collect and the rest is bad debt? How do y'all look at those ratios? Y'all classify it as, stuff that's never going to be collected versus you'll have those in different categories?
Well, actually, we utilize our tools that are at our disposal for as long as we possibly can. As long as we leave it up to the entity or agency that sent the debt over to determine whether it's collectible or not, or whether it should be written off or pulled back. So that's primarily responsible of the sending entity to make that determination.
So with some of those numbers, we know we've collected 140 million. How much outstanding debt do we currently have, and do y'all have that classified as just something that's low probability of collecting versus something that your 5 people are going after that we think we can collect?
That's something we haven't. We have about $500 million at this point from the various entities.
That's outstanding now?
That's outstanding right now. So, and at any given time, that number can fluctuate between 250 million to 750 million, depending on what's sent to us. So, as far as
the 140 million, that was just last year, or that was total collections?
That's total collections. Last year, that's total collections since inception.
And what's the inception roughly?
February. It's fiscal year 2015.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we're doing roughly 30 million a year of collection.
On average.
So 40 million, 30, 40, something like that.
Correct.
And you said it fluctuates between 250 to 500 million
outstanding
per year.
Mm-hmm.
What's the future benchmarks for this area of your division? Do you think that we'll consistently collect that 30, 40 million a year, or what do you think the rate of collection will be going forward?
Well, as we expand the tools that we utilize, we haven't fully engaged the other entities where we're doing driver's license suspensions,
tax return, liens of tax returns, things like that.
We're doing a bit of that, but we're actually leveraging some of the resources, a lot of the resources we have with our tax debt. But some of the other tools, like I mentioned, driver's license suspensions.
That's one. Don't you have the ability to go on tax refunds, and you have the
We are
ability
doing the tax offset piece, but
jackpot
there's some
winnings, things. There's in there 4 or 5 tools
right,
that
so
the legislature's
gambling
given
winnings
you.
we've not started doing yet. So when we move into those, I expect that we'll see an increase in collection activity. But getting to working with the casinos to be able to offset gambling winnings is something that we have to work through the technology on and expend those resources to get to that
Has the
point.
legislature provided you with the statutes that you need to get done? It's just a technology and a logistical issue at this point?
Correct. We had to
Okay.
get the system, get the division, the office created, have debt to collect, and then invest in the technology with the gaming control board and then with the casinos and the other gaming entities to actually have the technology to offset when someone comes in, that we know, one, that it is the person who has the actual debt, and then offset their gambling winnings to send it back to us.
Well, I have a few questions on the board, but Clarence, I appreciate the information. When in the future, when you come in front of this committee, could y'all start sort of tracking and providing us some updated reports on Office of Debt Collection to see how well we're doing. It seems like we're getting a good return on our investment there, but it sounds like we have a lot of room where we can improve, and we're eager to see, how you guys move along with that improvement.
Yeah, and just to mention, remind you, there were no positions actually allocated to this office for basically day-to-day operations. So we've actually taken positions from tax collection and added to the debt collection agency. So just to let you know what we're doing to beef up staff in that area. The positions of late, I've actually added 2 positions, full-time classified positions that were taken from a different area in the tax collection program to actually fund operations in Office of Debt Recovery.
Well, we appreciate that, and I hope you guys continue to improve on the collections. I have a question from Representative Bacala.
Thank you, Chair. I think you covered some of my questions already. The federal income tax changes that resulted in additional revenue to the state of Louisiana through income taxes. I think you guys last year in meetings anticipated that would be about $200 to $300 million. What's the actual that y'all have seen thus far?
Well, Representative Bacala, the state return is due May 15th.
Right, but I think obviously you receive funds throughout the year, and my next question was going to be relative to what percentage of returns you've seen already, and are the refunds. So I was going down that path next. I'm looking right now from the payroll withholdings. What was the number? I think 200 to 300 was given before. What was the actual withholdings submitted to you guys as our income tax increase?
So in terms of our withholding collections, I think that one, you saw the total income tax collections for the fiscal year that ended. We don't have total withholdings for this fiscal year yet. The average refund as of the week ending March 13th or 14th was about $488. In comparison to last year, it was about $500 at this time. So refund amounts are pretty consistent. We changed the withholding table so to be that way, and until we actually have enough individual income tax returns filed to evaluate.
If that average is holding true, I'm assuming you have a big enough sampling to anticipate that it's not going to move too much. What is the revenue outlook for income taxes this year versus last year versus the prior year? I guess it sort of covers the partial years.
I mean, in terms of the revenue forecast, I think that is what the REC does, but we were ahead of the forecast the last time the REC met on the individual income tax side for where we were supposed to be tracking for the year. And the next...
Well, I know you have some insight into it. Again, what do you think the increase annualized will be?
I think it is in keeping with the forecast that was adopted by...
I don't know what the forecast was. Can you give me a number?
I don't have the forecast, but I'm happy to pull it up. Is Greg still here? Mr. Albrecht? Maybe you can answer that. I don't have it directly with me.
Don't leave. I got a couple more questions for you.
I'm here, but I'm going to let him say exactly what the forecast was because I don't remember it right now.
Well, I don't remember the exact number, but I do think of it in terms of growth. Right now, for much of the fiscal year, we were running in year-to-date growth was 20% or more, largely because of the withholdings increases. As we've gotten into the second half of the fiscal year, and we're waiting eagerly for March collections data, that growth rate has dropped down to 6 or 7% growth over prior year. The forecasts are out there now in the 5 to 6%, expecting 5 to 6% growth over prior year, and looks like we are converging towards that.
Okay, so
general sense.
The original projection was a higher percentage than what we're seeing now?
No. The original projection was somewhere in the 5 to 6%, that this fiscal year would finish 5 to 6% greater than the prior year's collections.
Which is what we budgeted for?
Right.
In the current year, so it looks like we're pretty close to being on budget.
We think so. Even though for several months we had much higher pace of collections, but we did that deliberately through the withholdings process.
Okay. But it looks like we probably budgeted close to correctly on that.
We think so.
Okay. Thank you. I'll move on to another topic. Something that's been getting a lot of press lately is a central tax collector, and it's. I'm curious if the central tax collector bill were to pass the process, what additional cost would you guys incur? Would Department of Revenue incur, or have you anticipated that?
Well, the only thing that is filed right now is just a constitutional amendment without any direction on how the central collection would be implemented. So we have only assumed or made a guess that the department would be the central collector and that all things related to collection would basically be duplicated by the department. So we've made an assumption that we would have the same provisions in place mandating electronic filing of the sales tax return, electronic remittance of the payments, that we would do the audits or handle the audits. So we've been making those assumptions and trying to prepare a fiscal note to associate with the constitutional amendment, because we've been asked to do that, and the necessary programming. So we're making some assumptions, but there's no direction.
Well, on that,
in the
on those
bill.
assumptions, have you come up with a ballpark of what it's likely to cost?
We're assuming that to continue the current audit process that we have in place to audit the same taxpayers, because we already audit.
Well, I know
certain
some audits are
percentage.
done by the locals, and obviously you're a beneficiary of their audits as well.
But we also audit some of the same taxpayers.
Correct. Okay,
So we're making certain assumptions, and the technology.
could you give me a ballpark guess
We're-
of, I mean,
we're
$100
making
million or $20 million or?
Sir, our budget's
I know, I'm just
99
just
million,
trying
so
to tell
we're-
you, can you give me a
we're-
general
we're-
idea of what it might
We're
be?
assuming that we're somewhere in the maybe 5 to 6 million,
Okay.
maybe 8 million, but a lot of it's going to be a matter of, one, the Office of Technology Services has to, there's some programming cost associated with it, so that's a part of it.
Okay. And the revenue to offset that cost, would that be, would you withhold a percentage of the local revenue, or how would that work? No idea? Right.
We don't know. We don't withhold a percentage of state revenue now, so we don't know, and that's not in.
Okay.
Current bill.
I'm gonna give you one that's a little off topic but important to me. My understanding is that you guys have passed on to the Department of Health the identities of 1,700 people enrolled in Medicaid who made over $100,000 a year. Is that correct?
Through the information sharing under 1508.
Yeah. Okay. So 1,700 people enrolled in Medicaid made over $100,000. Is that a proper number?
I don't know that that's a proper number, because I don't think that is the actual information that was exchanged with the Department of Health.
Okay. Could we find that out? I think it's an accurate number, but anyway.
I do not think that is the actual information that was exchanged with the Department of Health.
Can you give me some insight into what information was exchanged with the Department of Health regarding the number of people making over 100,000?
Again, what was exchanged with the Department of Health was information regarding Medicaid recipients, and it was not their income level.
Okay, well, the next thing I will ask, since you would have to be part of the process, in HB1 last year, there was a requirement that the Department of Health use income tax records for the purpose of determining eligibility. Is that in place now? No, a month ago it wasn't.
That is being built into their new system.
I mean, are they using it now? Because HB1 required them to use it. Are they in compliance or out of compliance with HB1?
I don't run the
All right.
Department of Health.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Well, you would have to supply the information, so you would have that insight. But I appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I have a question from Representative Bagley.
Good morning, or I guess it's afternoon by now, Ms. Robinson. I've got if you'll pardon me, I've got a constituent that sent me a text that had a question for you, and or actually it was for me about to ask you. I said, well, I'll just do it right now. If you want to watch, you can. And the question says that it's my understanding that why is it taking so long for Louisiana tax refund back this year? I've read that it's slow all over, but the state could find no good reason given. The article I read said the electronic filing and direct deposit should get refunded within 21 days from the date of filing. But I've seen no evidence of this from my perspective. It's been around a month, March the 4th, since my taxes were filed electronically. Can you shed any light on this? I can't shed any light on it. I'll ask you to. Is there a reason why it's slow?
Well, I don't know what article he read, but the department's
There's
press
a lady
release.
who's a retired teacher. I used to teach with her. Yes.
Okay. The department's press release said electronic filing in 45 days would be the expected time frame, and the reason it takes the department 45 days is that we have built into our refund process a fraud detection process. We make sure that before refunds go out that it's gone through our fraud manager, because there is an increase in fraudulent refund requests, fraudulent filings, where people now go in and they submit tax returns that they've basically borrowed someone's identity and claimed a tax refund on that person's behalf, and the person doesn't know anything about it. So we do send our tax refunds through this fraud process, and that does add some time to it. So we tell people, expect your refund within 45 days. And so we do have a little more time built in than even the IRS, because the IRS does theirs a little bit faster than we do, but we tell them at least 45 days. So
Well,
if
her
she
information
will
was-
give us,
Yes.
if it's been 30 days and she hasn't received it, if she will be so kind as to give me her name, we will personally
Sure.
check. And make
I'll do
sure.
that. And but she had 20. She thought it was within 21 days. What she wrote in the letter, and I
Yes.
wasn't aware of.
No,
It's I
45
haven't filed
days.
mine yet. I went to the last minute.
It is 45 days, and we did have some, if it was a paper check that was being mailed, we did have some of those come back because some addresses have not updated, so we did have some paper checks that were coming back. So we'll be happy to check. And
Yeah,
make
I'll
sure.
I'll write her name down and give it to you when it's over. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Acting Chairman.
Madam Secretary, on that same regard, talking about refunds and tax returns, obviously LDR was in the newspaper about a week or two ago with double refunds. Can you give us a status update? I think it was around $26 million that was
Yes.
double refunded to taxpayers, our constituents, and I know that the department's been trying to remedy that. So where do we sit today, and how was that handled?
So to date, the double refunds that went out have, we have recouped 22.19 million of that back. The deposit that went out, so it was an electronic deposit that went out through the Office of Technology's banking system. We reversed that, and so through that reversal process, we've recovered 22.19 million. We've also worked with the third-party processors and recovered some additional funds. And so we have about 3.4 million, 3.5 million that we will have to send letters to those taxpayers to recover that additional money. Those letters will go out later this month to taxpayers saying you received a duplicate refund from the department. You have 30 days to return that to the department. This is the way that you can return that. You can pay it online. You can mail us a check. If you haven't returned it within that time period, interest will start to accrue. And then we'll send a follow-up bill to those people who still haven't returned the money at that point. So we've recovered over 85% of that money that went out in the duplicate refund.
Yeah, have you thought about the situation where that maybe a person lived in check to check and they thought they didn't understand the tax return fully, they let the third party handle it, and they thought that's what they were getting back and spent it? How do you work with those individuals that don't necessarily have the money right away to pay it back within 30 days?
So they will be able to enter an installment agreement.
Similar to OMV?
Yes, they can enter an installment agreement with the department. They will not have to pay the fee for that installment agreement. They can simply enter the installment agreement with the department. That information will be made available to them when they contact us, once they receive that letter saying that they still owe. They have that option to enter the installment agreement and can do that.
Because that taxpayer didn't do anything wrong.
Correct.
The mistake was with the department, correct?
Well,
Somebody had to make the mistake on that side. So I'm at, you know, my
Correct.
next question is going to be who made the mistake and how did it happen and how are we going to stop it from happening again?
so the mistake was actually a technology issue.
Within the department or a third party?
So it was a technology issue within the banking system. So a program ran longer than it normally does, and another program started, and so it duplicated a file. That is the best explanation I can give you from what I have received from the Office of Technology Services. It's something that's technically outside the department. So program runs longer. Another file is created. It's never happened before. It is, I think the initial explanation we got was it was a perfect storm type of event. So we put some procedures in place to ensure that this cannot happen again, including having another group within the department be involved in the process of approving the banking file before it is sent out by the external group outside the department. So we have put checks and balances in place to ensure that someone else is reviewing this within the department before it is approved for release.
And I appreciate you taking those steps. There's another high-profile issue, I guess, sort of reversed, of a tax that was paid by businesses, I think, on taxes on paid out-of-state, income paid out-of-state that was declared unconstitutional. Correct me if I'm not on Ways and Means if I'm misstating any of this. But there was around $70 million that was paid to the state, and that was an unconstitutional tax, but the state's position is because it wasn't paid under protest. I mean, that may be your position that you will not return the dollar. So I'm trying to understand, when the shoe's on the other foot, how does that work out? What's the difference from the first situation where the state's looking to get the money back from the taxpayer, but when you reverse the roles, the state's not willing to give the money back for an unconstitutional tax that was paid?
So in the second situation, what happened is the Smith case is a law that was passed in 2015 by the legislature, deals with a credit for taxes paid to the other state. And the other state in this situation is the state of Texas, which the court has now said for the state of Texas, it is considered an income tax. And so the taxpayers who pay tax to the state of Texas are entitled to claim this credit. Now, whether it's $70 million is a question. That's the amount of, the fiscal note says $33 million a year in taxes paid to other states. So you had one taxpayer, well, actually, I think 6 taxpayers that paid this amount under protest. It's roughly $1 million has been paid under protest. The procedure that is put in place to challenge a statute is that you have to pay it under protest and challenge the statute. That is the legislature's procedure that has been put in place. And the reason that is done that way is to protect the state fisc. If taxpayers are challenging the constitutionality of a law, you pay it under protest so that that amount is preserved in a separate account in escrow, so that if there's a decision that says that law is unconstitutional, that money has been set aside. The state can return it to the taxpayer at that point, as opposed to the state fisc being put in jeopardy at some later point in time when there is a court decision with everyone that did not pay it under protest coming in seeking a refund that you, the legislature, never anticipated. That has been the procedure that has been in place since the payment under protest statute was created. So that, and the Supreme Court, in a case back in the 80s, upheld that as the process that you go through when you pay under protest.
In his current decision, they didn't weigh in on that. They didn't make a ruling on that at all.
That has always been the law. And so recently there was another case, because there was a case challenging the franchise tax statute that took place in, I think, 2013 or 14. Those cases have all gone to the Board of Tax Appeals. They are claims against the state. The legislature hadn't paid those claims, so one of the taxpayers went back to the board seeking a refund. The board said, well, yeah, you can get a refund. The department said, no, you had to pay under protest to get a refund. Your only remedy is claim against the state, because that is the process the legislature has laid out. If you don't pay under protest, you can't claim a refund, claim against the state, because then you come to the legislature and have it appropriated. The Court of Appeal upheld that decision. Supreme Court denied writs recently. That is the process that has been in place for at least the last 30 years. Pay under protest if you're challenging a law. If you don't pay under protest, your remedy is a claim against the state. So for those taxpayers that did not challenge the Smith, like the Smiths did on the 2015 Act, their remedy is a claim against the state, which they are filing at the Board of Tax Appeals. You, the legislature, appropriate that money to return to the taxpayers. That is designed to protect the state fisc from
And I appreciate the
unforeseen
information on
judgments.
the second part of it. I wasn't aware of that, and it's very informative.
There is a claim against
So
the
there-
state
there is a-
procedure.
there is a remedy,
It
a
is
backup
not,
remedy.
Right. It is not me saying you don't get a refund and you never get your money back. The
saying it's a
remedy is
different
the claim
process.
against the state, which is
Good
a different
information.
process.
I have another question on the board, but before I go there, just a quick update. There was the federal tax changes that had some effects to the state fisc, mainly on the personal tax return side. Have we seen, and that showed positive revenue towards the state based on taxes paid against again, I'm not in the Ways and Means Committee. You know it better than I, so please correct me if I misstate anything. But have we seen all of those tax changes and their effects on the state on the corporate side as well? Because I know there's a delay in when those returns are going to be filed. Have we been through that entire cycle yet?
So that return is due May 15th.
That's what I thought. So do we have any expectations on what that fiscal note may look like in May? Because we know it was around $330 million on the personal tax side. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Right.
300-ish.
We have no idea what that corporate is going to look like, because corp was one, we got the benefit of the changes resulting from the federal income tax deductibility, but corp also had some other benefits that we did not even anticipate or attempt to anticipate corp. We didn't create a fiscal note. We didn't.
I'd like to get him to weigh in on one quick question. My question to Greg is has REC even looked at that, or what's their perspective on? Because it sounds like it's somewhat unpredictable.
Yeah, they didn't weigh
Corporate
in.
side is always a lot more unpredictable than the personal side, and there was no additional revenue added to the revenue forecasts specifically attributable to the federal tax law changes on corporations, in part because as Ms.
And what's the
Robbins-
fiscal note on the personal side again? Is it 330,
we added about
350?
302, I think, to the current fiscal year, and then it's expected to drop down to like 270 something million because we have a transition with the withholding changes, and ultimately we'll get back to a
So your testimony is we haven't calculated into REC just yet.
Right. Now the REC's forecast for corporate was raised in June, and it has been presented and then in the last several REC meetings with no adoption yet. There is a higher forecast for corporate presented to them.
Is that figured into it, or that's just trends from?
It's
other-
just based. We were seeing stronger collections anyway. There's no incremental fiscal note added in there, but there is just better collections.
You're looking at a $302 million and $270 million fiscal note on the personal side that we've already realized.
Or we are realizing.
Realizing. Any idea, is this going to be greater or less than that on the corporate side?
On the corporate side, I doubt it's greater. I think because it's just corporate collections are just much smaller.
What's your
than
gut
personal
telling you?
income. My gut.
I won't hold you to it.
We are. Someone will hold me to it eventually, but
That's a different meeting.
I mean, corporate collections are running well ahead of prior years, the way I kind of look at it during the year. The REC has not chosen to increase, even the forecasts that we've presented to them have been step-ups from the previous forecast, but still less than last year's actuals. I mean, I think corporate is where we might have some strength. However, I will warn, half to 2/3 of corporate collections are all collected in the last quarter of the fiscal year, and it can make you or break you without any warning.
That was my next point. It could be from May to October if you're following on extension, right? So,
Right. Well, in terms of fiscal year, there'd be accrual period, through August 14th, accrual back, but is where we would stop counting for this fiscal year.
but we'll see some that's right. But we'll see some of this in the next fiscal year as well.
Oh yeah, of course, and I think a lot of this will be a delayed effect because it takes so long for what happens in corporation returns to bleed down to the state level.
And it's you figure that may be feathered over the next from May to October, where you'll
Probably
just build it
next
into
2
the
or 3 years.
forecast every month.
Over the next 2 or 3 years. Much of the strength we're seeing in corporate now, I think, is really due to things we started back in 2015 session. We passed several pieces of state legislation without regard to the federal changes.
And Greg, so my understanding is it'll start coming slowly over the
Right.
next
Right.
the next year. And I guess what I'd ask is that we sort of explain that in REC, the difference between a tax change on the federal side that's having benefits to the state versus our actual
We've had that
economy
discussion the
and
last-
what's actually going on in our businesses, because there's several different narratives out there about Louisiana has a great economy versus Louisiana is having a negative economy. And we're trying to cut through and figure out what the actual facts are. And
We have been having that discussion at each REC meeting because corporate is one of the major taxes we talk about. If not for its size, which is not zero, it's 400 plus $500 million it can be, but its volatility is what
Yep.
leads to its discussion.
well, thank you so much for the information. I have a question from Representative Emerson.
You got it right today on the board. Luke, can you come to the table real quick? Thank you. Did you provide LDH with a tax analysis of Medicaid recipients yesterday?
Yesterday, sorry, Luke Morris, the Assistant Secretary of Revenue.
Okay.
No, I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Do you have a number on how many of those folks that of the Medicaid recipients make over 100,000?
The only thing that we prepared specific to that was some statistical information, but we provided it at the last Medicaid task force meeting, right? It was only up to, I think, $50,000, if I recall correctly.
Okay, thank you.
I was waiting for him to push his button. We have a question from Representative Bacala.
Just to be clear, that information was not submitted at the last task force meeting.
Oh, no, it wasn't. I don't believe it was prepared in time for that, but we did supplement.
My understanding is maybe it wasn't yesterday, but recently you guys gave an analysis to Department of Health. Did y'all give an analysis to Department of Health?
Representative Bacala, as I answered the last time you asked, we gave the Department of Health information on Medicaid recipients that they requested pursuant to the information exchange under 1508 B33 to be exact, related to income tax information that those recipients in a particular subset of Medicaid recipients, and that information was provided to them before the last task force meeting. It wasn't a recent.
Okay, well, I go back to the original question, and I'll matter of fact, I see the auditor in the audience. Will you step forward, please?
I gotta get up. Oh, no problem. I know y'all want to, but somebody gotta get up.
I don't know if you walked in when I asked the original question of the secretary, but the question was relative to how many people have been discovered through the income tax records to make 100,000 or more, than that number being provided to LDH. Do you have any insight on that?
I do not have that information, exactly how many. It is something I've been trying to get that information since September. Through the task force has been trying to get that information since September.
does the number 1,700 seem like, is that a number you've heard?
I've heard that number. In fact, I read that number in the newspaper the other day, but I've heard that number.
Okay, can we have any confirmation from anyone? It seems like it's common knowledge, but unsubstantiated. Nobody will actually verify. Can we get that number? If you do a tax analysis, there ought to be an analysis, and we ought to be able to extract a simple number from an analysis. It doesn't seem like it's brain surgery, except it seemed like nobody wants to answer the question accurately. If we're just going to avoid the answer, I'll move on. Thank you, Mr.
Madam Secretary, is that the question most appropriate to you or the Secretary of the Department of Health? He's just trying to get an answer.
And Representative Bacala's question relates to, he's asking about people who 1,700 and people who make over 100,000 in income. And what I'm telling him is that I did not provide information to the Department of Health on people who make over $100,000.
What information did you provide that's closest to that?
And what I'm telling you is that the information I provided to the Department of Health pursuant to an information exchange with the Department of Health that is protected taxpayer information and not to be disclosed in a public hearing.
Is there a legal prohibition against providing statistical information on tax information?
There is not.
Would you think this is not statistical information, which is statistically how many people fall into a certain category? That seems very statistical to me and not as protected.
And so, Representative Bacala, that is a point of disagreement that I think you're very well aware that we have, and that was the discussion at the last task force meeting.
Well, and look, I'm not trying to get off on a bad point, but it's relative to the budget, and it's relative to the budget of another office. But if you can provide information to us that's relative to another department's budget, that's why I asked the question. And I will move on because I just move on. Thank you.
Madam Secretary, for the record, what is, I'm following the dialogue between you and Representative Bacala, what is the reason, the department's official reason for not turning that information over to the legislature?
In terms of taxpayer information, I don't disclose taxpayer information beyond the statistics that I give you, the annual report, the tax exemption budget. So there is an ongoing question. Legislation has been brought by Representative Bacala to have the Department of Revenue provide taxpayer information to the legislative auditor for the auditor to conduct an audit of the Department of Health. That legislation has not passed the legislature. The opinion of the Attorney General is that the Department of Revenue's tax information is not to be utilized to audit anyone other than the Department of Revenue. It's not to be utilized to audit another entity. So that has been the source of the disagreement. Can taxpayer information be utilized to audit the Department of Health? And so, two opinions from the Attorney General: no, it cannot be. Two bills passed the House. They have not passed the Senate.
And I think the latest Attorney General opinion is this statistical information that we asked for is well within the definition of statistical information that you can release. Are you familiar with that, Attorney General, which is directly on point with this?
The point of disagreement is, can the Department of Health provide me with the information from the Medicaid applicant's application that I then run against taxpayer information and then provide you with a list that says, for these Medicaid applicants, that you can't use the taxpayer information to review, that I review it and then give you a list that says there's a difference or a variance in what they reported to me versus what they reported to the Department of Health of this dollar amount. So there is a disagreement between the Department of Revenue, the legislative auditor, and the task force as to whether that is considered statistical publication or not.
And I'm not familiar with the most recent Attorney General opinion, but how does that play into this?
So that's the recent opinion that That's simply a statistical publication for me to go in and do the review using taxpayer information to say if there's a difference between the Department of Health's information and the Department of Revenue's information. That's simply a statistical publication.
If I think there's contemplation that the audit review will issue a subpoena for that information based on the Attorney General opinion, what would be the next step for you guys if you receive that subpoena?
Well, actually, I don't think that is the plan, Representative Bacala.
I've heard it could be the plan.
Well, I guess we will have to see if that is still the plan, Representative Bacala.
Mr. Acting Chairman, if I could just add in, as the chair of the task force, what we wanted to accomplish was just to repeat some work that we had done back in 2017. We wanted to update that information to see whether or not, some of the things that we've done over the last year have it had any impact or didn't have any impact or whatever. The Department of Revenue, the Secretary, as she just said, believed they could not provide us that information. So we specifically went to the Attorney General's office with that scenario and that situation and asked, can the Department of Revenue give us this information, statistical information? And that Attorney General opinion is specific to this situation and does say that, yes, they can give us the information. But as you're hearing, the department will not.
Excuse me one moment. I have a question from the chairman, Chairman Henry.
Just real quick, do you think someone making over $100,000 should be on Medicaid?
No, but that is not the issue.
No, I'm just curious. If
No.
we don't think they should be, regardless of, shouldn't that be something we naturally want to root out as we move through the process? And we should use all tools available to do that?
And I think that is what the Department of Health is supposed to do.
And they're supposed to figure out the individual's tax returns. How would the Department of Health know what someone's income is?
They check the person's income when they apply for Medicaid.
They compare it to
Workforce data through their new eligibility system, which went live in November. That is what they're doing. I think they presented to this, well, actually, I think it was to JLCB. They presented the information on their new system that went live, that they check income based upon the Workforce Commission's data, which is wage information.
And where does Workforce Commission get their information from?
They receive it from employers who pay their workers.
Okay.
So they are checking it based on that. And I think they've explained to the task force that they are implementing to have federal tax information and Department of Revenue tax information in their system to check on a going forward basis.
So they'll be able to use the information to gauge someone's income.
To gauge their income.
So you can give the information to Workforce Commission, and then Workforce Commission can use it.
To the Department of Health.
Hmm?
No, to the Department of Health. Workforce Commission already receives wage information.
From you all, or from just strictly from the individual, just from the employers? That's it.
From the employer. That's what the Workforce Commission does. They receive wage
Okay.
information.
I'm just trying to figure out who. I'm trying to figure out what would be the roadblock.
Wage information is accurate. It's at least more real time than tax information. You file your tax return a year after. So your tax return for 2018 is due to the Department of Revenue by May 15th, 2019.
Correct.
Mr. Representative, though, one of the issues with wage information, it may be more timely in that it's filed quarterly rather than annually, but it's very incomplete.
Well, that's what I was going to question. That just assumes what if you have a second job, a third job, you get income from somewhere else? That would not be in that information, correct?
Our self-employment, our rents and royalties, our interest income, our retirement income, or a number of other incomes.
So that would not be in the workforce data, correct?
Correct. It is going to not be in workforce data.
So the only way to really get the complete would be to use some information from Department of Revenue. Like you would have it all. Like you would have all the rent income if somebody has that, or self-employed, or whatever terminologies we need to be. You all would have the most accurate information.
If it is reported on their tax return, we
Right.
will have that. Yes,
So that's why everybody wants to use the most accurate information to do this, correct?
correct. And that is what the Department of Health is building into their system.
Let me add something. It's not just that. And let me tell you why it's not just that. When the Affordable Care Act came in, it began to base the eligibility of Medicaid upon MAGI, Modified Adjusted Gross Income, a tax number. And it's a federal tax number. So naturally, you would think if we're going to base it on that, we would use that number to audit it. And that's all I'm trying to do, is use that number to audit it, since it's supposed to be a tax number.
And the worst case scenario would be someone who's making over $100,000 would no longer be on Medicaid.
Yes.
I mean that would be the end result of like the worst case scenario would be someone making over $100,000 would no longer be eligible for Medicaid. Correct? Is that it? Am I missing anything? Is that the end result?
Best I know.
That's it. The worst case scenario. Somebody making $90,000 would still be eligible. But somebody making over $100,000 would no longer be eligible. Correct? I'm not trying to make it complicated. I'm actually trying to simplify it. That's the goal. What would we be going for? Everybody agree to that?
I think the goal is that anyone who does not meet the requirements for Medicaid would not be on Medicaid.
But if you just started with 100,000, then you would just say anybody making over 100, if we just did that point, would be covered. Okay, I know sometimes we get caught up in all the specifics, and just the big picture is someone making over $100,000 would no longer be eligible. Gotcha.
Well,
okay.
I think it depends on household size, which is strangely enough ridiculous, but 100,000 with the right number of children, technically you might be eligible.
Yeah.
Representative Leger for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair. Secretary Robinson, I just want to make sure I get clear on this. I recognize that you're answering these questions in a very particular way, and my assumption is because as the Secretary of Revenue, you have an obligation to uphold privacy laws related to taxpayer information. Is that correct?
That is correct. There's a statute that says that that's what I'm supposed to do, and that I'm supposed to use the tax return information to administer the tax laws.
I assume that you have communicated with lawyers who represent the Department of Revenue in relation to litigation and other matters as you've made a determination about how you should answer these questions and how you should speak about taxpayer information in public settings.
That would be correct. And you might recall I have a bar card myself.
I was going to say I've worked with you over the years and know you to also be an excellent lawyer. The question isn't whether or not you personally believe that the information should be supplied. The question is whether you believe under your obligation as a Secretary of Revenue, you have the legal authority to provide the information. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. And the statutory authority is limited, and there is also, in the law passed by the legislature, a criminal provision that when you violate this statute, there are criminal consequences for doing so. And I have a clean criminal record. Other than the occasional speeding ticket, I'd like to keep it that way.
I understand. And further, you and I have worked on a lot of legislation over the years where these issues have come into play, whether it's the tax credit registry,
right,
where we were working to ensure that fraudulent transfers of tax credits were not possible. We had concerns and issues related to taxpayer privacy that we had to address, didn't we?
We have always made sure that we address
as we've worked on remote dealer bills over the last several sessions. We've had many issues related to taxpayer privacy that we've attempted to protect and resolve, correct?
That is correct.
Certainly we agree that people who are not eligible to receive Medicaid should not be receiving Medicaid.
They should not be receiving Medicaid.
And to the extent that you're authorized to provide this information under law, I assume that you will be happy to provide it as you're required to.
Very happy to provide it, and happy to provide the information to the Department of Health so that they can do what they need to do to make sure the people who should not receive Medicaid are not receiving Medicaid.
Are you working with the Department of Health as they implement a system to be able to utilize taxpayer information to assure eligibility requirements are met?
Yes.
When do we expect that program to be fully operational, or is that a question better for the Department of Health?
I think fully operational is a question for the Department of Health. I've heard May is fully operational for them with tax information, but I've also heard 2 prongs to fully operational. So federal tax information being the first prong, and then state tax information. Federal tax information
Is handled at the federal level, correct?
Right.
They also have taxpayer privacy issues, correct?
Correct. And theirs is the more accurate information because 1099 information is submitted to the federal government. It is not submitted to the state by businesses, so they get the more accurate information. We actually wait to get that information from the IRS. So they do have better information. So the federal tax information is the priority for the Department of Health.
And do you have any responsibility in engaging with the Department of Health and with the IRS to ensure that that connection is made?
We have offered to assist them in any way that they need with the IRS, but they have a liaison with the IRS because the IRS knows that health agencies through CMS need access to this information.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Leger, I know you didn't ask me a question, but can I add into the answer of the question?
Certainly.
The task force and the auditor wanted this information. We didn't want identification of any taxpayer. We only wanted statistical information. And I know for the 35 years I've worked in government, I've always heard that I had to comply with the AG opinions. So we have an AG opinion now that says this is statistical data. It will not identify, does not put any taxpayer at risk. And you can't take this data and drill down in some way to a taxpayer. It would only provide us some statistical data to tell us how well we're doing or not doing as it applies to eligibility. So I guess, again, I just don't understand why we don't want to comply with the AG opinion and provide the information, but that's...
I'm not sure that that's the case, but I'm certain that the department will continue to work with you on the issue. Right, Secretary?
That is correct, Representative Leger.
Thank you. Thank you.
Representative Leger did such an eloquent job of describing Madam Secretary's roles in government. But on the same point, Mr. Auditor, why do we employ you, and why would you want this information? Can you just hit on that real quick?
Well, I'm the state's auditor, so we audit to make sure that the funds are going to where they're supposed to go and going for the reasons they're supposed to be, where they're being spent for.
And do you want personal tax data, or what's your intent to get this information?
The data we asked for here was not individuals' personal tax data, just statistical data.
Our jobs in the legislature is to protect the taxpayer dollars and make sure they're being spent in the most efficient manner to run a government in the most efficient way, and you serve a large role in that charge, correct?
Sure.
And I think that, I can't speak for Representative Bacala, but I think that's the reason why he has so much passion on the issue, Madam Secretary. And I think I just encourage you to work with him and work with the legislature so we can make those the programs within the Department of Health more efficient, because I really think that's what Representative Bacala's true intent is, as well as the chairman, as well as myself and the legislature.
And I can assure you that working with the Department of Health has continued to be a priority for the Department of Revenue, and we have continued to do that.
Madam Secretary, thank you so much for your time today. That concludes our agenda today.